I'm doing number 1 on page 99, and in this problem we are talking about the market for chocolate ice cream. And this problem tells us that there is a reduction in the amount of cattle, that milk-producing cattle out in the Midwest who supply cream to our chocolate ice cream producers. And so the problem asks us to consider what the effects of this event are on demand, supply, and equilibrium price and quantity of the chocolate ice cream. So let's consider our supply and demand model. So we have quantity here on the x-axis, we have price on the y-axis. I start with just an initial supply curve which rises from left to right, reflecting the fact that our suppliers are profit maximizers. And then we have a demand curve that decreases from left to right, reflecting our law of demand. So here in this market we have a ostensible equilibrium point where quantity supplied equals quantity demanded, where supply equals demand, and that's at this intersection point right here. And this equilibrium corresponds to an equilibrium quantity. This is the quantity of chocolate ice cream supplied and demanded in the market. That is equilibrium. Where the supply and the demand in the market meet, we have equilibrium. So this is equilibrium quantity. And if we come across to the left, we have our equilibrium price. This is the price that corresponds to the equilibrium quantity where supply equals demand. So let's say that at $4 a pint of ice cream, all of this suppliers are happy. They want to sell an amount of ice cream at $4 a pint that consumers are exactly willing to buy at $4 a pint. And that is this point in the center here where the two curves intersect. And the quantity is how much those consumers would have been willing to buy at that price. So let's say that at $4 a pint, they'd be willing to buy 20 pints. Well, our equilibrium quantity at that point would be 20. And our equilibrium price at that point would be $4. So this problem tells us that out in the Midwest, let me change my color. Out in the Midwest, we have a situation where there's a reduction in milk-producing cattle who produce the milk for the cream that goes into the chocolate ice cream. So we have a reduction in cream, which ultimately means we have a reduction in chocolate ice cream. So what that essentially means is that we have a reduction in our supply. And so if I come over and consider this initial equilibrium point that we're at this intersection, well, nothing has happened to the price of chocolate ice cream, but because of whatever has happened to this cattle, our supply has been reduced. There's a shift in the supply curve. And remember, this comes back to the lesson where we discussed the difference between shifts and movements in curves. This change is not originating from a change in the price of chocolate ice cream. It's originating from something else, and that something else is a reduction in the cattle that produce the cream that go into the chocolate ice cream. So from this equilibrium point, we shift to the left to this new yellow dot that represents a reduction in supply, and this is a shift in the supply curve. That is a reduction. So our supply curve moves to the left, and I denote that as sub 2 there. So I want you to consider where we are at this moment in time. Let's come down to our equilibrium quantity. Our original equilibrium quantity was where the quantity demanded of chocolate ice cream equaled exactly the quantity supplied. That is equilibrium. Now we have a case where the supply has moved. Okay, so now the supply is no longer here. The supply has actually moved over to the left. So this is the new quantity supplied. So we still have the old quantity demanded at that original point, and we have the new quantity supplied. So at this moment in time, when supply initially decreases, we have that quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied. Quantity demanded is to the right of quantity supplied. And so what we actually have in this case at this moment is a shortage. More people demand chocolate ice cream than the supply of chocolate ice cream. And what will happen is a kind of bidding, right, up. You can think of that auctioneer in the video that I showed you. There will be a bidding up of the price until we arrive at a new equilibrium, which is this blue dot here. That is now the new place where demand equals supply. So if I come down, and I'm going to, so if I come down here, this is my new place. I'm going to come all the way down so you can see it. This is the new place where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. It's the new supply with old demand. And if I come over to the left here, this will give me the new price that corresponds to that new equilibrium. And so let's look at what happened to our equilibrium price and quantity. Our equilibrium price increased. Our equilibrium quantity decreased. We went from equilibrium quantity 1 on the x-axis to equilibrium quantity 2 to the left there. It decreased. And this is exactly what your book on page 90 tells us is going to happen. When quantity supply decreases, we have a reduction in the equilibrium quantity, and we have an increase in the equilibrium price. Moving on to number 2. Okay, so moving on to number 2. Hold on one sec. Okay. Number 2 says, or part B, says, a new report by the American Medical Association reveals that chocolate has significant health benefits. So what this immediately brings to mind to me is that people think that chocolate will increase their health, will make them healthier, and so they will increase their demand for chocolate and thereby for chocolate ice cream. So let's look at our supply. I'm going to try and make this big this time. And demand model, where this is quantity on the x-axis and this is price on the y-axis, and we have our upward sloping supply curve representing the fact that our suppliers are profit maximizing. We have a downward sloping demand curve reflecting the law of demand. When prices decrease, our consumers will demand more. ceteris paribus, all else equal. And what we consider from this picture is that we are initially at a point, say, where we are in equilibrium. The problem really should have told you that. We begin at equilibrium because it's not clear that your market starts at equilibrium. So we start in an equilibrium here where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. So let's just consider where we are here. This is exactly the place where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. As a result, this is our first equilibrium point, equilibrium quantity. And if we come over to the left from equilibrium onto the y-axis, we will get the equilibrium price that corresponds to the equilibrium quantity. So it's just the price and quantity where buyers and sellers are happy. Buyers are getting what they demanded and sellers are selling what they would like to sell at that price. Now we have that the demand for chocolate ice cream increases because people think that they'll be healthier if they consume more chocolate. And so from this original equilibrium point, with no change in the price of chocolate ice cream, we have a shift over to a greater demand at that price. Again, this is just a shift in tastes. And as a result, we have a shift in demand. So we have a new demand curve here. And I'm going to call this demand 2. Okay. So at this point, now consider, if I come down to the x-axis, I now have, and I'm going to cross the old demand out because that is not any longer where demand is. We have quantity supplied is still there. Supply has not moved, but now demand has moved. And this point down here on the x-axis is where my new quantity demand exists. At this moment, I'm going to cross out equilibrium because we're no longer in equilibrium, and we have a case where the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. At this moment, quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied. Quantity demanded is to the right of quantity supplied. We have a shortage. More people want ice cream at that price than suppliers are willing to supply at that price. And so what will happen is a kind of bidding war with our hypothetical auctioneer where the price will start to go up. Suppliers are realizing they can increase the prices because a lot of people want chocolate ice cream. And so we'll get a bidding war where prices start to go up until the point where we get to a new equilibrium where quantity supplied again meets quantity demanded. This is our new equilibrium. So I'm going to put equilibrium 2 here. This was, I'll change the color back to green. This was equilibrium 1. Okay. Now, to consider what the change has been to equilibrium quantity and demanded, I really need to come down to the x and y axes. So let me erase real quick to just make this a bit clearer. Sorry, this is going back to white. Oh, why? Okay, so now let me come down to the x-axis to show you that this is my new, I'm going to come all the way down, quantity supplied, and this is the old supply, equals the new quantity demanded. And this is my new equilibrium quantity. I don't know if you can see that. That's equilibrium quantity 2. And if I go over to the left, I have equilibrium price 2. This is the price and quantity that correspond to my new equilibrium. So if I take a look at what has happened to the equilibrium price and quantity, I see that my equilibrium quantity, which used to be to the left of the EQ2, equilibrium quantity has increased. And equilibrium price has also increased. So, and this corresponds exactly with what we are told in your book on page 89, that when the quantity demanded increases, then the equilibrium quantity will increase and the equilibrium price will increase. I mean, this is intuitive. If people start demanding more of a product, if they start demanding more of ice cream, then suppliers are going to want to supply more of it at a higher price. They want to try and meet that demand at a higher price. This is just common sense. All we've done in this illustration is just show how we can show that on a supply and demand model. So I'm going to start again, and now I'm going to move on to part C. So moving on to part C, it says the discovery of a cheaper synthetic vanilla flavoring lowers the price of vanilla ice cream. So here, and what they should have told you is that vanilla ice cream is a substitute for chocolate ice cream. What they're assuming in this problem is that you will switch to vanilla if the price of chocolate ice cream goes too high. So keeping that fact in mind, which we really should have had from the beginning, let me consider how I might show the changes in the equilibrium price and quantity of chocolate ice cream in a supply and demand model. So I'm going to make my price axis here and my quantity axis here. So this is quantity, this is price. I'm going to start with a supply curve that slopes upward from left to right, reflecting profit maximization on the part of producers. I'm going to also draw a downward sloping demand curve that reflects the law of demand, that a decrease in the price of a good will occasion an increase in the demand for that good, all else held constant, ceteris paribus. And now we say, and remember, this is the market. It gets confusing when we start talking about more goods, but we have to keep in mind, we are talking about the market for chocolate ice cream. So all the movements and shifts that we graph are the movements and shift that happen for chocolate ice cream. So what we have to ask ourselves is, if vanilla, the synthetic vanilla, lowers the price of vanilla ice cream, what is going to happen to either the demand or the supply of chocolate ice cream? Because vanilla is a substitute, we're thinking that when the price of vanilla ice cream lowers, the demand for chocolate ice cream will lower, because people will switch to a cheaper substitute, to vanilla. So let's pretend that we originally begin at equilibrium. Again, something that this problem should have told you from the get-go. You begin at equilibrium. And what is equilibrium? Equilibrium is this point. So I'm going to put this as my first equilibrium, where the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. And if I come down on the x-axis, I can show that very clearly. This is quantity demanded, but it is also quantity supplied, which is what gives me my first equilibrium quantity. If I come over to the left, I have an equilibrium price. that corresponds to the equilibrium quantity. Now, the demand for chocolate ice cream has decreased because people are switching over to a cheaper alternative, a cheaper substitute. So from this original equilibrium, individuals have reduced their demand. So I'm at a new point for demand of chocolate ice cream that is reduced. And this, our chart tells us, justifies a complete shift in the demand curve. Again, nothing has happened in the price of chocolate ice cream. The movement is occasioned by a change in the price of a substitute, which justifies a shift in the demand curve. So at this moment, we no longer have quantity demanded where it used to be. So I'm actually just going to scribble it out. We still have quantity supplied where it was, but we no longer have quantity demanded at that original equilibrium point. Quantity demanded has actually shifted to the left, and it is now here. This is our new quantity demanded point. At this moment, we have a scenario where the quantity demanded is less than the quantity supplied. Quantity demanded is to the left of quantity supplied. So what we really have here initially is a surplus. We have more chocolate ice cream in the market than consumers are purchasing. And as a result, we'll see a bidding war down. So if you imagine that price ticks all these points until the point where we hit a new equilibrium point, and that is here, the second intersection of supply and the new demand. So this is our new equilibrium point. Now let's consider how this equilibrium quantity and price has shifted in relation to the original equilibrium. So if I come down here, I have the value of a new equilibrium quantity. This is E sub Q2. And if I come to the left here, I have a new point for the equilibrium price. And what we can see is that the equilibrium quantity has been reduced, and the equilibrium price has also been reduced. This should be intuitive. If people are no longer demanding as much chocolate ice cream as they used to, then there's going to be a moment in time when we have a surplus. We have too much ice cream on the shelves, more than people are willing to buy. So in order to get rid of that amount that is in surplus, suppliers are going to start cutting back they're going to start lowering the price of that ice cream up until a point where consumers are again willing to purchase the amount the suppliers want to sell at a certain price, and that would be our new equilibrium quantity. This also corresponds to page which one are we doing? We're doing C. So this corresponds to page 89, which tells us that a decrease in the demand will lead to a decrease in the equilibrium quantity and a decrease in the equilibrium price. So I'm now going to move on to part D. Okay, so hold on one second. Okay. All right. So part D tells us that new technology for mixing and freezing ice cream lowers manufacturers' costs of producing chocolate ice cream. So right then and there, I'm thinking to myself, okay, the cost of manufacturing ice cream is reduced. And what that means is that at a certain price, suppliers will actually be able to supply more. So this new technology is allowing them to produce more at the same prices that they were producing before. And so I'm going to, again, start with our supply and demand model to try and show this graphically. So I have my price axis on the Y, quantity axis on the X. So this is quantity. This is price. I'm going to start with a supply curve that's upward sloping, reflecting the fact that suppliers are profit maximizing. I'm going to also graph a demand curve that is downward sloping, reflecting the law of demand. And I'm going to imagine for a moment, a piece of information you should have been told is that we start at equilibrium. We start at this place where suppliers are supplying exactly the amount that they would like to supply at this price, and consumers are exactly willing to purchase the amount that suppliers supply at that price. So let me come down to the x-axis and start the way I usually do, which is to say, okay, this is the point where the quantity demanded, this is exactly the definition of equilibrium. Quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. And that is what defines our equilibrium quantity. So this is the first equilibrium. And we have, on the x-axis, we have the price that corresponds to that equilibrium quantity. And now we consider that the new technology for mixing and freezing ice cream lowers their costs. So there has been at this moment no change in the price of ice cream, chocolate ice cream. What has only changed is that they have, suppliers now have new technology where at this price they can produce more. So we can imagine from this original equilibrium an increase in supply to a new point. And we know from our chart that this is a shift in the supply curve. So this is our second supply curve. At this moment, this initial shift, supply is no longer where it used to be with the original equilibrium point. So I'm actually going to come down to the x-axis and cross out the quantity supplied being where it used to be. And now we only have quantity demanded. And we also don't even have an equilibrium point at that point anymore, because quantity supplied does not equal quantity demand anymore. So if I come down to the x-axis from this new shift in supply, I have my new quantity supplied. At this moment, I have a quantity supplied that is greater than the quantity demanded. I have more producers than I do buyers. And so what I have here, again, is a surplus. They've produced more at this price. They've produced more chocolate ice cream, and at this price, consumers are not willing to purchase that much ice cream. So there's a surplus. And this price will get auctioned down until the point where we reach our new equilibrium, where the new quantity and the old demand intersect once again at this new blue dot, the second equilibrium. And to find out how our equilibrium quantity and demand and price has changed, we come down to the x-axis. This will give us our new, and I'm going to come down here so you can see it, the new equilibrium quantity. And this will give us the new equilibrium price. And what we can see now is that equilibrium quantity has increased and equilibrium price has decreased. This should be intuitive. These suppliers with no increase in demand have just gotten a new technology that allows them to produce more chocolate ice cream. So obviously the quantity that they're putting out into the market has increased. At the same time, because there's been no increase in demand for chocolate ice cream, they need to lower the prices to get consumers to purchase all the ice cream that they have put out into the market. And so price will be reduced. And it corresponds to the relationship that's stated on page 90 of your text that says that when you have an increase in supply, you will also have an increase in the equilibrium quantity, but a decrease in the equilibrium price. So that concludes number 1.